Hi guys, it's Mark Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zickery of Space Command. And I just got the sad news that Stan Lee, the great Stan Lee, has just passed on. And I wanted to do a little remembrance of him and share with you what an amazing life and career he had. Interestingly enough, I met Stan Lee. He actually shot at the Space Command studios, so at the end of this video we'll be sharing that little remembrance with you as well. It was amazing when I met him because he seemed like a man in his 60s, and I was astonished to find out that he was actually in his early 90s, a phenomenal guy. The energy and the clarity of mind he had were just amazing, and the strength of his personality and the enthusiasm was just really remarkable. I was very moved and impressed when I met him, and it was a thrill to meet him and have him sign some of my collector's editions of Marvel Comics that I had. He signed a couple of issues for me, which was spectacular and wonderful, and those are treasures in my collection. But here's a few things about Stan Lee that you may or may not know. He, unlike many of the comic book creators who made a name for themselves when they were young, for instance, Siegel and Schuster, who created Superman, did that when they were basically teenagers. They started working on that idea when they were in their teens. Whereas Stan Lee had a fairly unremarkable career up to his middle age. He was almost 40 when he was working at Marvel. He'd been working there since he was a teenager, essentially, and doing kind of very forgettable titles. He'd written like a couple of, like a book of humor, little odds and ends, but nothing where anyone would ever remember him. And this is right coming off of the 50s, where Dr. Wortham had written Seduction of the Innocent, and there'd been congressional hearings about comics that had basically ended the reign of EC Comics, because, you know, there were all these strictures put on comic books to make them more sanitized and less daring, and it was and no one was sure where comics were going. And Stan Lee wouldn't even tell people what he did for a living. When he was at a party, he would say, "Well, I'm a writer," and then they would say, "Well, what kind of writer?" And he would say, "Well, I write children's books. You know, I write for children." And they would say, "Oh, like Dr. Seuss." And then finally, he'd have to fess up, No. I write comic books." And then people would either say something derisive or just turn and walk away in contempt, because it was like saying you were a pornographer at that point, because, you know, people believed that comics created juvenile delinquency and all sorts of stuff. And ironically, Dr. Seuss, who was hugely successful at that time, making millions, had been in the same unit in World War II as Stan, writing various, you know, propaganda films and booklets and posters and so forth for the service. So but here he was, middle-aged, wondering if he'd gone down the wrong path in his life, and he was about to quit Marvel Comics and try and find a new career for himself, perhaps as a novelist, when, and by the way, he used the name Stan Lee rather than his real name, Stanley Lieber, because he was saving that for novels. When he would be a serious novelist, he would use his real name, but Stan Lee was his nom de plume. So he was going to quit, and this is just when the head of Marvel had said to him, DC is doing Justice League, where they're combining all these heroes and it's selling really well, so why don't you see if you can come up with something similar for Marvel? And his wife said, you know, if you're going to quit, why don't you write one comic that just is basically the way you would want comics to be? And that gave him the idea. And so in very short order, he came, you know, in collaboration with the terrific artists Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, he came up with Spider-Man and Thor and the Hulk and the Fantastic Four and the X-Men and on and on and on, Daredevil. I mean, what's really phenomenal about Stan is that whereas most of the other creators of comic characters, the iconic comic characters, created one, you know, Siegel and Schuster with Superman, and Bob Kane with Batman, and even Bob Kane's credit on Batman. There are other people like Jerry Robinson who were very instrumental in the creation of the Joker and so forth. But with Stan, he was writing these amazing comic books and coming up with these astonishing characters, one after the other, and the Avengers, of course. And, you know, Captain America, he had revived from the 40s, but again, he put a new spin on it. And the Human Torch, who had previously been a sort of a standalone character with a very different backstory, became part of the Fantastic Four. But Stan was very great at this kind of humor and excitement and enthusiasm. The enthusiasm and humor he had as a person, as a stop sign, the humor he had as a person, the irreverence and the jauntiness, he was able to put into the comic books, as well as the fear of the nuclear bomb, because again, these became science fiction characters because they were all given their powers via nuclear bomb tests, trips into outer space where they were exposed to cosmic rays, being bitten by a radioactive spider from a research lab. I mean, again and again, these were not magical creations by and large. These were scientific monstrosities, essentially, because Marvel had been doing monster comics that were sort of knockoffs of monster movies of the era. And Stan took that and combined it with all the other things he'd been writing for Western comics and romance comics and so forth, as did Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, his wonderful artistic collaborators. Now, the fascinating thing is the angst that particularly Steve Ditko brought to things and the dramatic exuberance that Jack Kirby brought in his work combined greatly with Stan's qualities to create characters that were neurotic and unhappy and trying to find their place in the world. So it's basically a metaphor for being a teenager long before Joss Whedon explored that in Buffy, and yet these characters were also funny and fun, and the stories were really delightful and entertaining to read. And so for the first time, comics were not just being read by kids, but they were being embraced and read by college kids and adults. And so Marvel was off and running. And Stan, and the other thing that's amazing about Stan was a terrific, sorry about the sirens, guys. Stan was a terrific self-promoter. And so he was perhaps his greatest creation because he was in the middle of it. And whereas the other comic book companies, you didn't know who the editors were, and often the writers and artists weren't even credited, in Stan's comics, he was center stage. He was the ringleader of the Marvel bullpen, the mighty Marvel bullpen, and he was letting everyone know who the writers were and the artists were and so forth, and even the letterers and the colorers. I mean, he was giving them all nicknames and so forth, and there was a fan club, and you could get a record album with all of the Marvel personnel speaking on it. So he was personalizing it and making it a relationship between the creative staff at Marvel and the readers. So it was all one family, and so this was hugely successful, and it created the modern age of comics, along with what Julius Schwartz and Mort Weisinger were doing over at DC with the Silver Age, Flash and Green Lantern and Superman and Batman and so forth. So and Stan always saw the possibility of getting into film and TV. So very early on, there were animated adventures of Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four, and attempts to do movies, and finally, in recent years, they got it right. And now, of course, Marvel is a huge behemoth owned by Disney, and Kevin Feige is overseeing the Marvel films at Disney, and also now starting to oversee even the ones at Fox, and which I guess is being bought by Disney as well. But Stan kept in there, and the fact that he was in all the Marvel films in little roles and cameos, and I understand they filmed even more of them, so that even once he's gone, as sadly he is now, they'll continue those cameos, which is terrific. But meantime, the one other great thing about Stan Lee is that unlike Siegel and Schuster on Superman, who ended up with lives of great poverty, and the comic book artists had to step in, and the comic book writers, and basically defend them and get them a settlement that allowed them to at least not live in desperation. Stan had deals with Marvel that, although it didn't pay him the billions he deserved, certainly made him a multi-millionaire and certainly comfortable financially. So it was a happy ending for him. And recently there had been some contentiousness and some charges of going back and forth, and I think that often happens when people get into their upper 80s and 90s, and it's sad, but Stan was still asserting himself, still putting out videos, still being Stan Lee, and certainly he had a joy in interacting with the fans, and that joy and that exuberance and that positive quality and that delightful energy remained with him. And I was very glad to have him come to my studio and shoot some scenes there, and I'm so glad I got to meet him. It was really a thrill of my life, and that's about it for now. So I'm gonna, with no further ado, I'll cut to the video I did with Stan, and we'll talk again real soon. Thanks, guys. Hi guys, it's Mark of Space Command, and we are here today on the Space Command sets shooting Trek Isolation with the legendary Stan Lee. I thought it'd be terrific to have someone like Stan Lee on the Space Command sets, christening him, so to speak.
Miss Parker, bring the lieutenant in.
It's a great day with Stan Lee. Really one of the legends. Amazing to have him here on my sets.
Admiral?
Stan, what did you grow up reading science fiction?
Oh, everybody, Jules Verne.
And Ray Bradbury and all those guys? Yeah, wow. Well, thank you.
Sure.
It's an honor to have you here. It's
Oh,
an
thank
honor
you.
to have you here to Stan.
An honor to be here.
Well, Thanks very much. You never know who's going to stop by the Space Command sets, and this is certainly a very special day, and we'll talk to you again really soon. Bye-bye.